Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. I was trying to think of a way that we could have Sunday school somewhat until we could be in the building together again in person. And I thought that I would read to you the story that goes with our Sunday school lesson that we would be doing at church from the Gospel Story Bible, the same one we use with our Sunday school curriculum. And then encourage you with your family, parents or grandparents. If you don't have a copy already, pick up the long story short. This is a 10-minute devotion that goes along with our Sunday school story. There are about 5 days of Bible verses to read, activities, things to talk about, questions to discuss, ways that the story points us to Jesus, things like that you can do as a family at home, but we'll all be working on the same story together. So I wanted to bring you our story today is David and Goliath. This is lesson 57 from 1 Samuel chapter 17. We talked about David a good bit recently in the Sunday morning children's message. Remember, Samuel was the prophet of the Lord who went to Jesse and looked at all his sons and thought that the oldest, most handsome one would be the one God would anoint to be king, but God said no, that he doesn't look at the outward appearance, but he looks at the heart. And so God told Samuel to anoint David, the youngest one. And so he did. But David is not yet king. He is still taking care of his father's sheep out in the fields, and our story finds us when David is a young boy, not yet king. So let's get started. Not long after David was anointed king, the Philistines gathered their armies to attack God's people again. Saul was still king, but the Spirit of the Lord had left him. The Philistines were on one mountain, and King Saul's army was on another, with a valley in between. The Philistines had a great warrior named Goliath on their side. He was 9 feet tall, so taller than the ceilings in this room. And he wore heavy armor, kind of like the Incredible Hulk, a really big guy, really intimidating and kind of scary. Each morning for 40 days, Goliath came out to the soldiers of Israel and made fun of them and their God. But they got really tired of that, don't you think? He dared them to fight and said, "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." 1 Samuel 17, 8 and 9. The men of Israel were terrified, and no one volunteered to fight Goliath. From time to time, David traveled to the battlefield to bring food for his brothers in the king's army. One day, David was there to hear Goliath mocking Israel and daring the soldiers to fight him. David asked the soldier, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David's oldest brother scolded David. "Who do you think you are to be talking to us like this? You don't have the right to say anything." But when Saul heard about David, he called for him. David told Saul, "I will go and fight this Philistine." But Saul saw that David was just a boy. Still, David did not give up. He told Saul how the Lord had helped him kill lions and bears all by himself. He said, "The Lord who delivered me from the lion and the bear will deliver me from this Philistine." So Saul, at last, agreed. He offered David his own armor to wear, but it was too heavy for David. Instead, he took only, do you remember what he took? 5 smooth stones, his staff, and a sling, and he went out to meet Goliath. When Goliath saw David coming toward him, he mocked him and said, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" 1 Samuel 17:43. David replied, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. He will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down. Everyone on earth will know it is the Lord who saves." As Goliath moved toward David, David put a stone in his sling and hurled it at Goliath. The rock hit him in the forehead, and the mighty Goliath fell to the ground. Then David ran to Goliath, took out his sword, and cut off his head, killing the great giant. When the Philistines saw that Goliath was dead, they ran in fear. The men of Israel chased them until they won a great victory. When we read this story, we like to compare ourselves with David, but we are more like the men of Israel, afraid to fight and in desperate need of a champion to save them. David was God's man for the job. He did what the Israelites could not do. The salvation David brought Israel should remind us of Jesus. Like David, Jesus was a king who went to battle on our behalf. His victory was over sin and death. Before David delivered the men of Israel from Goliath, they stood helpless against him, just as we are helpless to save ourselves and need Jesus to deliver us from our sin. David's life points to Jesus, and this story helps us see we are not saved by our own strength, but by God's power. All right, and there are 3 questions at the end of our story. Let's talk about it. What does Goliath say against God? Remember, he was making fun of God and making fun of the Israelites. He dared them to fight and said, "Choose a man for yourself, and then we will be your servants if they kill Goliath. Otherwise, if he didn't, they would be his servants." And Goliath mocked Israel and mocked their God. Why doesn't anyone want to fight Goliath? Would you want to fight Goliath? He sounds pretty scary to me. He's a really big man, really tall, and he wasn't very kind. So I think I probably would have been afraid to fight Goliath. And then the last question says, how is David different from all the other soldiers? So David wasn't afraid to fight Goliath, was he? Because he had the Lord on his side. He knew that God would be with him, that even though Goliath had a spear and a javelin and armor, David had God, and that was way more important. So thanks for joining me for our story time today, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.